Okay, in this video, we're going to learn how you name the covalent compounds and what the covalent compounds actually are. Now, covalent compounds are made only between nonmetals. So in the previous video, we have learned that nonmetals, they like to gain electrons when they make ionic compounds. But since you're making a compound between all nonmetals only, both of them cannot be gaining the electrons at the same time. So in those cases, they come on to a compromise where none of those gains an electron or lose an electron, but they actually share electrons. All right. So the foundation of the formation for these covalent compound is the sharing of the electrons. So when the electrons are being shared between two nonmetals, that's what keeps those two nonmetals together at one place. Okay, so since you're sharing electrons, no one is giving up electrons and no one is really taking in electrons. There's really not any positive and negatives in a covalent compound. Okay, so since there is no positive and negative, no cation, no anions in this, however, when it comes to naming these covalent compounds, you treat the first nonmetal as an cation, all right? So you are only assuming that the first nonmetal is an cation, even though it's not an cation. It's only for the naming purposes. And assume the second nonmetal to be as your anion, only for the naming purposes. Okay, so then once you do so, you also have to specify how many of the nonmetals you're using in a given compound, and to specify those you have to use prefixes. Okay, so if you're using one nonmetal, you use mono. If you use two nonmetals, you use di, tri, tetra. So this is the list of the prefixes that you're going to be using when it comes to naming these covalent compounds. And believe it or not, naming covalent compounds is much easier than naming ionic compounds, because you have to worry about too many things. You have to worry about the charges, and you have to worry about whether or not to use Roman numerals and all that. In covalent compounds, all you really have to worry about is be able to use the right prefix in them. Okay, so let me give you an example, and that will actually clarify things. Assume I have this CO2. Okay, so this is a very common compound, and you already know what the name of this is. But the very first thing you want to make sure you ask yourself, if this compound a covalent or ionic. Okay, so carbon and oxygen, they're both nonmetals. Okay, so that's going to be in a covalent compound. In CO2, you guys probably already know what that is. It's actually carbon dioxide. All right. Now let me kind of break down the rule that we just learned how we're going to be naming these. We said the first nonmetal that you have in a covalent compound is going to be treated as an cation. All right. And what we have learned about the cation, we don't really change the name of the cation. We just name as the name of the element. Okay, so that's why we left this carbon as carbon. We didn't really change it to carbide or anything, even though it's in a nonmetal, because we're treating this carbon as an cation, even though it's not in a cation. Then we have oxygen as our second element in there. So since it's in a second element, we're going to treat this as an anion. So if oxygen is being treated as an anion, how the name going to be? Well, it's going to end up with an ide, right? It's going to end up with an oxide, obviously. And since there is actually two of the oxygens, I would have dioxide there. Okay? So that's why it's called a carbon dioxide. Okay, so then let's look at maybe another example. What if I have N2O4? Okay, well, I'm going to treat my first nonmetal, which is the nitrogen, as an cation, so I'm not gonna change the name of that. It's just going to be nitrogen. However, there's two nitrogen being used in there. Okay, so I'm going to call that dinitrogen, and then there's four oxygens. So oxygen being the second element, it's going to become oxide, but then you have to specify how many oxygens you're using. It's going to be tetraoxide. All right, because remember this prefix for 4 is tetra, that's in right here. What about something like IF7? Okay, so since there is only one iodine, I would call that iodine, treating this as my cation. And then fluorine, since it's the second nonmetal, I'm going to treat that as an anion, so it's going to be fluoride. But since there is 7 of those, I'm going to say heptafluoride. Okay, so that's iodine heptafluoride. If I have assumed this right there, CO, what's that called? CO is called a carbon monoxide. Now remember what I said earlier. If you have a prefix 1, we use if you have 1, we use prefix name mono. Now 1 is only used anytime you have the second nonmetal to be 1. Like if you have only the first nonmetal that's 1, you don't have to use mono for that. It's just automatic that there's only 1. If you have the second nonmetal that's 1, then you want to use mono for that. Like for example, for CO, I didn't really call it monocarbon monoxide because mono is not technically used for the first nonmetal. If you just say carbon, is just automatically assumed it's only 1. However, if you have the second nonmetal that's only 1, then you want to make sure you use mono for those. Okay, then obviously they could actually give you the name. For example, they give you carbon tetrachloride. Now, how do I know if it's an ionic compound or a covalent compound? Well, I'm using the prefixes. We don't really use prefixes in any of those ionic compounds. So the prefixes are only used in covalent compounds. So that's how you know it's going to be a covalent compound. So it's going to be carbon being our first element, and there's only one carbon. I don't have di, tri, or anything in front of the carbon. So then the second element is chlorine, because it has a chloride here, but there's 4, it's tetrachloride, so there's got to be 4 chlorine, so it's going to be CCl4. So that's how you're going to be figuring out the name or the formulas of these covalent compounds. Now, when you're doing the names of these ionic compounds and the covalent compounds, you must ask yourself the very first question, which starts with, is this ionic or covalent compound? And then you want to go in that direction. Anytime students forget to ask those questions, if it's an ionic or covalent, they will end up getting a wrong answer for the most part. If it's an ionic compound, then ask if the metal is coming from the fixed charges or the variable charges, and you want to name that ionic compound accordingly in that respective rules. And if it's in a covalent compound, then you're only using the prefixes. All right, so hopefully this video is helpful, and I'll have some examples posted in a separate video.